I am Rachel D'Agostino, curator of printed books. I co-curated the exhibition Hearing Voices, of which this is a part, with Sophia Dahab, who is sitting here with us tonight, and you will get to hear more from Sophia tomorrow. Sophia and I jointly wanted to say some thanks very briefly. This was a pretty mammoth effort, both the exhibition and the symposium. So if you will allow me to just read a few names to you from our staff. Particular thanks to Allison Kronstadt, Dana Dorman, Katie Maxwell, Fran Dolan, Joe Placeres, Rachel from Dan Scheinman, from recent staff, Rachel Hammer, Carlton Goals, and Blanche Brown were extremely helpful to us. Supporters outside of staff that really deserve a great deal of thanks include Stephen Peitzman, Mariah Thompson, Charles Rosenberg, whose name I would mention continuously for a month if I were to really emphasize how instrumental he has been in creating our medical history program, supporting this exhibition, et cetera, et cetera. Abraham Gutman, Regina Steigerwald, all of our speakers, of course, and the rest of our staff. And I think that is, I mean, you know, everyone I've met in the last 3 years, probably I should thank too, because they've listened to it and tolerated this and everything. So thank you, world and family. All right, now I am going to introduce our director, executive director, Edwin Wolf, the second director, Michael Barsanti. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all here with us tonight at the Library Company and tuning in from home. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II director of the Library Company. The title is confusing in several different ways. One, it makes it sound like my name is Edwin Wolf, which would be kind of nice. I greatly admire the man. But he was Edwin Wolf II, which introduces another layer. You probably weren't struggling with this, but as I introduce myself, I do. I'm really honored to be able to introduce Stephen Fried tonight. Stephen has been a friend of the Library Company for several years. In what I've come to understand about Stephen is that normally contact with Stephen is there's usually preliminary rumblings of the earth that happen before Stephen finally reaches you. Someone will say, "Hey, I saw Stephen Fried last night and he wants to talk to you about Benjamin Rush." And then someone else will come to you and say, "I saw Stephen Fried and he was talking to me about how the Library Company should be doing that." Like they're usually, it's like John the Baptist. This word comes beforehand and then Stephen comes to you, which makes it a lot easier to start conversations. Although starting a conversation with Stephen is never a problem. We're really grateful to have Stephen here tonight. I think we all owe him an enormous debt for his work. I feel particularly indebted to him for his work on Benjamin Rush, his biography, which certainly opened my eyes and opened the eyes of many Library Company members and shareholders to the importance of that particular founding father. And what Stephen will be talking about tonight is, I'm sure in some ways ties out to that, his own, well, I'll let him tell you the story. But let me just give you the quick details of Stephen's bio. Stephen is an award-winning journalist and a New York Times best-selling author who teaches at Columbia University and at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of 7 acclaimed books, including Rush, Revolution Madness, and The Visionary Doctor Who Became a Founding Father, which was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. He also wrote Appetite for America, Fred Harvey in the Business of Civilizing the West, One Meal at a Time, and Thing of Beauty, The Tragedy of Supermodel Gia, which introduced the word fashionista into the English language. A 2-time winner of the National Magazine Award, Fried has written for Vanity Fair, for GQ, the Washington Post Magazine, Smithsonian, Rolling Stone, Glamour, and Philadelphia Magazine. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife, author Diane Ayres. So please, Stephen, welcome, and thank you for visiting with us tonight.
Thank you. That was very kind. Thank you very much. everybody here in person, and everybody who's watching on Zoom. As Michael said, I have a great debt to the library company that was incredibly helpful to us when we were working on the Rush biography. So thank you to all the staff here who helped on that. Thank you to all the people who worked on this exhibit, which is wonderful. And thank you for the opportunity to be the keynote for this wonderful look at the history of mental health care. And I hope my experiences in this, which cover a number of years, will offer some insight into some of the readings you have here and the symposium that we have tomorrow. So I will say first, because this is what we must do when we talk about mental illness, it'll come as no surprise, but portions of this talk may be triggering. So when I was 25, I decided to go to a small town and try to solve a case. Most of my fellow young, hungry, impressionable journalists from the first generation raised on in cold blood yearned to solve murders. I wanted to solve a suicide. 2 teen suicides linked by a pair of handcuffs. On a chilly Friday night in November of 1983, 2 young men, one 16, one 17, climbed in the dark to the top of a 300-foot cliff overlooking a quarry. They sat on the edge for the next 2 hours, talking about their lives into a tape recorder, taking 11 hits of acid until they got up, handcuffed themselves together, and jumped off the edge. 3 months later, while the community debated how to really address these issues of their lives and deaths, one of the boys' girlfriends took her father's handgun and his car, pulled to the side off a road off Route 309, and shot herself. I started driving up to Quakertown, where these kids lived, hoping to give voice to the 3 who had been lost and to those who were trying to figure out how this had happened. Most of those involved spoke pretty openly with me, which in 1983 was even rarer than it is today. I thought I'd be working there for a few weeks. Instead, I ended up working there on and off for the next 3 years, piecing together the interior lives of traumatized and guilt-ridden friends, families, school officials, and mental health professionals. The story came out just before the anniversary of their deaths. By then, I assumed that I had learned pretty much everything there was to know about this town and about the secret lives of its teenagers and parents and caregivers. I also assumed I had learned a lot about the cutting edge of mental health and addiction care and suicide prevention, especially when the piece was well received, won some awards, and started being used by schools and therapists all over the state. Because I had written about 3 teens who took their own lives, I was encouraged by mental health professionals to give voice to another suicidal patient who had a better result. Turned out that in the same mental health practice, there was a 14-year-old young woman who had not only survived a similar period of suicidality, but had written a powerful English composition for her 8th grade class about it. Instead of writing about her, I arranged to have her composition published in Philadelphia Magazine. And I annotated any information I thought the reader needed besides her own writing. But soon I had a rude awakening and a huge mental health reality check. One of my sources for the suicide piece, a police chief in the small town where the cliff had been located, was arrested for multiple counts of child sexual abuse. One of his victims had been friends with the boys who took their lives and a source for my story. I was stunned that I had misjudged him. I mean, you just don't expect your pokey small town cop character to turn out to be a criminal. But as a journalist learning how to cover mental health, the news caused me to face a more existential crisis. When you invest weeks and months into recreating a big cautionary narrative story, you do it in part because the saga seems like the tip of an important iceberg. But as I consider what my story had implicitly blamed the Quakertown suicides on, family dynamics, drugs, depression, school pressures, all those new cutting edge social challenges of 1983, like cable television and heavy metal music, I realized I hadn't even considered several other possibilities, including sexual abuse. What if I had been looking at the right tip, but assuming the wrong iceberg was beneath? And as I wrote the story, about this pedophile police chief, who, by the way, cooperated with the piece because he felt that his love for these 10-year-old boys was nothing wrong and that someday society would understand that there was nothing wrong with it. I began for the first time to really understand how complicated and challenging and sometimes just impossible mental health and addiction care can be. I set out to try to give voice to as many patients, family members, caregivers, and public officials as I could, from the past as well as the present, and I've actually been doing this for almost 40 years. Sorry. I started with a magazine article on the tragic life and death of supermodel Gia, a story that everyone thought was about the fashion business and how it corrupted a beautiful young girl, but to me turned out to be a story of a young gay woman suffering from mental illness and addiction before she ever became a model, and how she self-destructed on the international stage, became a heroin addict, got pretty good inpatient treatment and outpatient medication-assisted treatment, but still didn't make it. She made several suicide attempts, but had an incredible resistance to drug overdoses. And in 1986, at the age of 26, she became one of the first well-known women in the world to die of AIDS. That 1998 article later became a book in 1993 and an HBO film, which marked the breakthrough performance of Angelina Jolie. One of the struggles associated with the article and the book was that Gia had told her friends that most of her problems were because of her mother and her parents' divorce. But I knew from the changing mental health literature that that kind of Freudian reductionism, blame the parents for everything, was really going out of style. And while Gia was gone, her mom and her siblings were alive and they talked to me. Their descriptions of the situations were actually more complex than what Gia had told her friends, which is not surprising. I tried to give voice to everyone with an informed opinion and actually got a lot of grief from some of Gia's friends for insufficiently blaming her mother for her depression and her drug addiction. While I was finishing the book on Gia, which my wife Diane, who is also a writer, was editing, we found ourselves in a medical nightmare that led us to giving voice to an entire different group of patients, those afflicted by neurological and psychiatric side effects of prescription medications. In Diane's case, she had a seizure and a manic reaction to one pill of a new antibiotic she was given for an infection it turned out she actually didn't even have. This caused us to interact with a number of prominent docs at HUP and Pennsylvania Hospital, but also nationwide. It also introduced us to the old Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, 49th and Market Street, because one of her doctors had his outpatient office there. I found the place utterly fascinating. It was like a living museum to the history of American mental health going back to before the Civil War. Diane's doing great, by the way. She's right there in the third row. Hi, Diane. As for American mental health care, well, that's kind of the story we're here to talk about. You know, when it was founded in 1844, the Institute was called the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. It was a building of grand hallways lined with what were once all patient rooms, but now had been turned into small offices for psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. There were over 200 top clinicians in private practice, many of whom had originally trained there when I started hanging out there reporting. There were old school psychoanalysts, newly minted psychopharmacologists, everything in between. There were generations of learned people who were leaders in their field and disagreed on so much about mental health. Behind one door was a doctor who would tell you that your mother screwed up your life and why you needed 5 days a week psychoanalysis. Behind the next door was a doctor who would tell you that was ridiculous. Parenting had nothing to do with mental illness. It was all genes and biology, and you needed medication and a different kind of talk therapy. Behind another door was a doc telling you that trauma caused all mental health issues, requiring a different kind of therapy. Spending time there caused me to confront, as a medical consumer and as a journalist, the incredibly broad pluralism of mental health care, the endless debate over oceans full of bobbing, dangerous icebergs. It made me understand just how many compelling, possibly right answers there are to mental health problems, and just how challenging that can be for patients seeking simpler answers to illnesses of our most complex and unfathomable organ. Every generation discovered there's a new, in fact, every person diagnosed with mental illness or with a diagnosed family members discovers there's a new. Some embrace this reality, others flee from it and from treatment. I spent the better part of a year at the Institute interviewing patients and doctors and writing this piece. This is actually one of the cool pictures that was taken during the piece. And I learned a lot about the history of the place, going back to the 1840s, when it was the first major asylum in America and the birthplace of what became the American Psychiatric Association. The Institute is where I first encountered the ghost of founding father Benjamin Rush. Years later, that introduction led me to write a biography of the good doctor and to make a case that American mental health care began not in the 19th century at the Institute, as is often claimed, but in the 18th century, right after the Revolutionary War, at America's first hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, which is right down the street from where Diane and I live. It's a little hard for Philadelphians to get their head around what Pennsylvania Hospital looked like when Rush was first there as an apprentice. It was just the original 8th Street building then, and everything south of Pine Street was still open land and farms. This is what it looked like when 23-year-old Benjamin Rush returned from medical training in Edinburgh, London, and Paris in 1769. And the patients with brain diseases, which included not only mental illness and addiction, but epilepsy, autism, and all other developmental disabilities. At that time, no one really knew how to separate them out. Were not so much treated as they were warehoused in the basement cells of the hospital. That's those ground floor windows you see there. Patients were chained, their cells were not heated because of the belief that crazy people couldn't tell the difference between hot and cold. And the hospital made money by charging tourists to come and see the madmen. This is what Rush looked like at the time. And the first major patient he was asked to consult as a newly minted physician was actually a very prominent mental health case. His name was Captain John McPherson. He was a wealthy merchant seaman who, when Rush met him on August 18, 1769, had been chained in a room in one of the cottages on his property in Mount Pleasant, being treated clandestinely for madness. He'd already been seen by Dr. Thomas Bond, with whom Benjamin Franklin founded Pennsylvania Hospital, and several other top docs. Rush was brought in for a 5th opinion about how to treat his obvious mania. Got an itchy trigger finger on this. The prominent attorney overseeing McPherson's all-star treatment team was John Dickinson, who had been McPherson's best friend, but was now being accused of trying to steal the ranting captain's wife and all his money. Founding father buffs will immediately understand the small world irony of young Rush being asked to treat Dickinson's best friend. Anybody know why? Come on, you guys live in Philadelphia. 7 years later, when Dickinson refused to sign the Declaration of Independence on behalf of Pennsylvania, Rush would be elected to sign in his place. McPherson eventually got better, and after he was released, he made it his life's work to prove that he had never been mad, publishing 2 long pamphlets on his treatment. He became, in some ways, the first anti-psychiatry advocate. So you can see that a lot of the things that we think are modern and happened in the 20th century, the 19th century, I mean, have been happening a lot longer. Well, Rush didn't specialize in mental health. No doctor in America did until years later. He did from an early age treat mentally ill patients, and he recognized his own mood swings, which it suggested he might be bipolar himself. Upon returning to America in 1769, he described his own depression as being so powerful that for the first time he, quote, believed the many accounts which have been published of melancholy and even suicide following similar emotions of the mind. He also wrote with great psychological insight about racism and slavery. In his 1773 pamphlet calling for an end to slave keeping, he described the trauma that it caused. He offered the then controversial opinion that Black and white people were medically the same. He used the word equal. And he pronounced that any major differences between the races were caused by slavery, which was so far into the human mind that the moral faculties, as well as those of understanding, are debased and rendered torpid by it. He also attacked racial prejudice against Black people. While this book was not published under Rush's name, he circulated enough copies with letters from attached that everybody knew he wrote it. Almost overnight, he lost half his patients. Rush was elected to the Continental Congress in the summer of 1776, just in time to sign the Declaration and lead the medical committee. During the war, he wrote about preventive medicine for soldiers and kept notes on what the trauma of war did to some soldiers. He also admitted to being traumatized during the war himself. After the war, he began working and teaching at Pennsylvania Hospital. This put him for the first time in direct contact with mentally ill patients locked in the basement. As early as 1783, medical student lectures show him describing madness in a new modern way. Instead of viewing aberrant, antisocial, or self-destructive behaviors as the result of immorality, demonic possession, lack of faith, or lack of self-control, he talked about them in the language of medicine. He told the medical staff and students that melancholia was, quote, a disease of the body as well as the mind, that mania was, quote, a disease of the brain, that both had various causes, including, quote, hereditary disposition. He also met some of the patients who'd been living there for a while, like 60-something Hannah Lewis, who had been committed by her fellow Quakers at the Philadelphia Meeting House because of her delusions and erratic behaviors. Rush diagnosed her with grief-induced madness triggered by the loss of her husband. She became one of the first patients that Rush and his staff tried a new technique on. They actually talked to her to better understand her thought processes and errors in thinking, and they wrote down many of the things that she said. Rush quickly came to understand that a lot of mental illness was associated with untreated alcoholism, and that in fact more than half of the patients at Pennsylvania Hospital were there for something having to do with alcoholism. He wrote a serious paper about the problems of distilled beverages, and when it didn't get enough attention, he offered a more magazine-y chart to spur conversation. This moral and physical thermometer, which actually, when you put Benjamin Rush's name in Google, is the first thing that comes up today. Keep in mind that beer and wine at this time were not considered intemperance; they were considered temperance. Only hard liquors were considered temperance. Of course, it's all fine if you drank beer, wine, or water. This is what happened to you. Just all good things: cider, wine, porter, strong beer, just all really great stuff. But if you drank hard liquor, starting with punch, you can see how bad it could get. Just every bad thing, all kinds of death, suicide, murder. So don't drink those things. Was the takeaway message. Several years later, he organized his ideas about the medical nature of mental illness and presented it as the annual lecture for the American Philosophical Society with his friend and society's president, Benjamin Franklin, back from Europe and in attendance. It was an early attempt, fascinating for a man of so much faith as Rush. Rush was really a very devoted Christian, to try to pry mental health away from the province of religion and sin. If anything, he wanted clergy to begin praying for medical treatments to work, rather than telling ill patients that if they prayed harder, they could get well and would not need treatment. I wish that this dynamic seemed like a really old thing, but I think that we are explaining this to people almost every day today when they are diagnosed with mental illness. Wildly controversial at the time, the lecture is the cornerstone of our concept of mental illness and addiction as medical conditions. Following that lecture, he began more publicly advocating for additional funding for mental health and addiction care. He publicly challenged the hospital's managers to spend more on brain health and create an entire new building on the other side of the block facing 9th Street that would be just for the treatment of mental health and addiction. He also finally managed to have heaters put in the cells, banned the sales of tickets to see Mad Men, and because the treatment became more humane, began attracting more patients. He did all this several years before Philadelphia became the US capital in 1790, and I was surprised to discover several years before others in Europe who history has generally credited with some of the same innovations. The French physician Philippe Pinel began what he termed moral treatment at the hospice of Bicêtre, my French is really bad, in Paris in 1793. And he didn't lecture and publish about it until the end of 1794. William Tuke first opened his influential York retreat in 1796, which is the same year the Pennsylvania Hospital finished and opened Rush's new 9th Street mental health building. Well, I'm not saying who had these ideas first, and we don't see Rush and Pinel acknowledging each other in writing until the 1800s. It is pretty clear that Rush put many of these ideas into action first, and in America, because he controlled patient care and physician teaching almost a decade before Pinel or Tuke did. One of the main differences between Rush and his European counterparts is that they were more focused on using early versions of what we would now call clinical psychology. Rush, as a physician, treated all kinds of patients, not just mentally ill, and he believed in trying medical treatments of the day, which were largely bloodletting and purges, as well as talk therapy, which was back then much more a therapist talking at you, trying to manipulate you and sometimes just screaming at you. While many of Rush's medical treatments are no longer used, which is true in many areas of medicine, what we need to be careful of is not letting these older treatments be seen as a type of torture because they weren't. No more than, say, bone marrow transplants for breast cancer, which not long ago were the standard of care, and now no one would do them. Anti-psychiatry activists, many funded by the Church of Scientology, have encouraged this kind of thinking. But keep in mind, they are against all medical treatment of mental health, including its diagnosis. These treatments were crude, but they were also the best treatments available and given with care. They were moral treatments, the most moral treatments that existed at that time. This chair, for example, was created as a more benign way to restrain people than locking someone in a straitjacket and letting them lay on the floor and soil themselves. It also featured a method of blocking out light and noise for early sensory deprivation. Well, Rush taught all these ideas to his students, and he trained the first 3,000 physicians who became doctors in America. Much of his hope for the future was pinned on his firstborn, his son John, who trained to be a physician and had a special interest in mental health. He wrote his med school thesis on causes of sudden death and boldly included several forms of self-harm, including derangement producing suicide. This drawing is the only image we have of John, just a doodle in one of his dad's journals. The reason there's no formal portrait is that instead of inheriting his father's legacy and treating mental illness himself, John became a victim of it. In his late 20s, while serving as a Navy doctor in New Orleans, he got into an argument with his best friend over a quote from Shakespeare and was challenged to a duel. He won, but after killing his friend, he descended into madness, and he never fully recovered. Instead of overseeing his father's legacy, he spent the rest of his years as a permanent patient in the wing of Pennsylvania hospital that his father had built. This is actually his admission record. Rush died in the spring of 1813 at the age of 67, and the year before his death, he had two disparate mental health goals. One was to do founding father family therapy and rekindle the friendship between his two friends, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who had not spoken in over a decade. He did accomplish that. The other was to honor his patients, including his son, by writing the first ever American book about mental health. This is the copy he signed for John Adams. And this is what the spine looked like. It was just called Rush on the Mind, which inspired this later painting of him. Many of his innovations died with him. And one of the things that's important to remember about the history of mental health is that it's really not linear. We lose ideas, we lose insights, and we lose fundings for insights. So the idea that if things were really bad in 1815, it meant they were really bad in 1812 actually is not true. Some of the things that turned bad in 1815 were because Benjamin Rush died and no one took his place. And so funding went to something else. And this is part of the history of mental health care through today, unfortunately. Many of his innovations died with him. They required funding, staffing, and continued diligence. You could make the argument that this was the first of many cycles in the US when the best available evidence-based medicine was more available than ever to patients who needed it, and then the funding got cut and it wasn't. In the years after his death, Pennsylvania Hospital returned to selling tickets to let people see the Mad Men and became more of a mental health jail. This is likely part of what inspired the completion of the first private mental health asylum in the US, Friends Hospital, which opened in what was then the northern suburbs of Philadelphia in 1817. And it was nearly 30 years after Rush's death before Pennsylvania Hospital decided to take a bold new step in care and create its own elaborate asylum in Philadelphia's western suburbs in 1841 under the direction of Thomas Kirkbride. In 1844, it became the birthplace of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which in the late 1800s changed its name to the American Medico-Psychological Association, with a seal depicting Benjamin Rush. In 1917, it published the first manual of diagnoses and statistics, which starting in the 1950s would morph into what we now call the DSM. And in the 1920s, its name was changed again to the American Psychiatric Association. The organization for those trained in psychological practices who did not have an MD, the American Psychological Association, was founded in the late 1890s, had its first meeting also at Penn. And it was at that time mostly for people who researched psychology and did psychology testing. What we now know as clinical psychology began to rise during and after World War II, when supportive therapy and counseling done sometimes by non-docs became more popular during war and then peace. Post-war saw a rise in mental health care of all kinds, all still pretty undeveloped, in part because of the creation in 1949 of the first National Institute of Mental Health, but probably more important, the GI Bill and the Veterans Administration's clinical psychology training program. Psychiatry was dominated by Freudian psychoanalysis. Psychology was much more practical. And this was also the beginning of the rise of care for people who couldn't afford daily psychoanalysis. It was also the beginning of the use of earliest psychoactive medications, mostly antipsychotics, since most people with mental illness were diagnosed with the blanket term of schizophrenia, and there are only 1 or 2 drugs for them. I've been lucky enough to learn, I was lucky enough to learn about this time period from the physician widely credited with being the most influential figure in mental health since Freud. This was this guy, Dr. Aaron Tim Beck, who was the creator not only of our most popular form of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, but also developed the experimental methods to prove the efficacy of the treatments and make them what we call evidence-based, which also means they are more easily covered by insurance. On the left is Tim Beck at the height of his career in the 1970s. He's well known for the bow tie, which he told me was a fake bow tie because he just was too lazy to tie one. And this is Tim when I met him in 2019 and started interviewing him weekly until he died at age 100 in the fall of 2021. Giving voice isn't only about the patients and the families, it is also about the caregivers and the researchers. Tim helped me understand how psychiatry and psychology grew both together and apart during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What he helped me understand is that the debates and critiques that each generation thinks they discovered, and the complaints that each generation of patients and family members thinks is so specific to their unique situation, are part of endless cycles of mental health symptoms and mental health care. They are structural, not personal. Many of them grew simply out of the fact that the affected organ, your brain, is also the one you use to understand your situation. And when that is true, differences in severity of illness make a monumental difference. All of this is why he wanted to develop a form of talk therapy that was short-term, focused on changing behavior in the present, not plumbing the depths of the past. And ideally would be tried before medication, or at least always in tandem with it. He was incredulous that so many people treated mental illness just with meds. This is Tim and I at Rittenhouse Square the first time we left the house after COVID. And this is Tim in October 2021 during our last interview. We used to just lay the microphone on his chest because that was the most comfortable thing for him. He worked until the very last day of his life. Early in his career, he perfected the first short-term directed non-psychoanalytic talk therapy, which he developed first for depression, but later adapted for anxiety, traumatic disorders, even for psychotic disorders. In his last years, you'll meet one of his last colleagues tomorrow, Paul Grant. He was working to develop a cognitive therapy for people hospitalized for years with schizophrenia. I hope one day to be able to write a book about what I learned from Tim. In the meantime, I recently did this long magazine article for the Pennsylvania Gazette. I've also had the opportunity to give voice to a couple other major figures in mental health care who speak from multiple perspectives. In the mid-90s, I got an assignment to profile an up-and-coming psychiatry professor at Johns Hopkins named Kay Redfield Jamison, who had co-authored the primary textbook on manic depressive illness and an academic book about creativity and mood disorders, was drawing attention to mental illnesses by posthumously diagnosing dead artists, poets, and composers, and arguing that their lives and art could have been extended with proper treatment. After my first interview with Kay, she called me and asked if she could discuss something off the record. Then she admitted that she had the illness that she had devoted her life to treating and writing about. She told me she was working on a memoir that she wasn't sure if she would publish, but that she felt more comfortable with me outing her first in a magazine. We started working on this a year before her memoir was sold to Knopf, and the piece was published 6 months before the book came out, An Unquiet Mind, considered by many the best book ever written about mental illness. During the writing of this piece, my wife and I became friends with Kay and her husband and editor, the late Dr. Richard Wyatt, one of the world's experts on psychotic disorders. Richard also had incredible insights into the challenges for spouses and family members to be supportive caregivers for people with brain diseases. Richard inspired me to write a piece for Glamour one year on Valentine's Day about the role of love in couples facing chronic illness. Diane put up with me writing about this, even though sometimes it can get a little personal, because she understands better than most, as an amazing fiction writer herself and the main character of a couple of my pieces, the power of giving voice to these kinds of ideas and the importance of telling the truth about the impact of these illnesses. Her main challenge now is seizure disorder, which is happily under good control, and miracle of miracles, her main medication just went generic. After the 1990s, referred to as the decade of the brain, ended, and many of the promised medical and political huge leaps forward did not materialize, and then the Bush administration focused more on the war on drugs than expanding mental health and addiction care, I dialed back my mental health work taught new journalists how to do the work at Columbia and Penn, and learned how to write narrative history books. Then I found myself sucked back into the work during the Obama administration when the 2010 Affordable Care Act brought new access to mental health and addiction care, dovetailing with the promise of the 2008 Mental Health Parity Act, which made insurance discrimination against these illnesses illegal, but was still challenging to enforce. I got a chance to give voice to the players in the behind-the-scenes politics of mental health and addiction. A politically connected pharmacologist friend introduced me to recently retired Congressman Patrick Kennedy, son of the late Ted Kennedy. Patrick had just left Congress and was trying to revolutionize advocacy for all brain illnesses. He brought a new kind of hope to the field, talking about how we needed to fight legally for equality of care, which made me see the drama of this a new way. He was also very newly sober and had obviously been saved from himself and his illness in part by love. And as I said, I honestly feel we pay way too little attention to the role love plays in these illnesses. So I wrote a mental health parody love story about him and his fiance. And when it was done, we started talking about writing a book together, to this, A Common Struggle, in which Patrick, for the first time, tells the behind-the-scenes story of his own mental illness and addictions, but also those of his family members. It was also a way for me to understand the law changes since the 1960s, which were meant to shift care for people with these illnesses from large asylums to smaller, community-based mental health facilities. But the laws and then actions by the Reagan administration in the 80s succeeded in closing the old, large, outdated facilities, but never got around to replacing them. We are still waiting for that to happen, and Patrick is a great warrior for the cause of forcing it to happen through healthcare law, making the Parity and Addictions Equity Act, which he and his father got passed, into a law as powerful and protective as, say, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The book came out in 2015 with a big interview with Patrick on 60 Minutes. Our talks around the country reached a lot of people, and we prepared for a paperback in 2016, the year we assumed the Democrats would hold the White House and do even better for mental health. So for the paperback, we created an in-depth 26-page appendix of a complete new national behavioral health platform, addressing every possible issue in addition to mental health and how to solve it. And then, of course, the election didn't exactly go as we had planned. But the agenda is still there, and we still believe it can be put into place. In the aftermath of the book, Patrick and I did a presentation at a Philadelphia synagogue where I saw in the audience a guy I had known growing up in Harrisburg but hadn't seen in decades. And immediately on seeing him, flashed back to when I was a teenager and his older brother took his own life on Yom Kippur. It was my first ever experience of mental illness, and I had never before really thought about how much it influenced me to write about the subject. I met with him afterwards and realized that in 40 years, he had never really spoken about his brother's death. We agreed it was time for him to give voice to his brother and himself, and so we did. This is Elliot Miller, who shared his family stories, and this was his brother, Siggy, whose death in 1972, everybody I knew talked about for exactly one day, and then never mentioned it again until Elliot agreed to come forward. It's a reminder that it is never too late to give voice to a story about mental health, and it's never too late to properly mourn. There's an anniversary every year for these losses, and whether you're able to confront the enormity of the loss at the funeral, at the first anniversary, or the 44th anniversary, it is not too late. Here's the story we did together, which led to me giving talks in house of worship, not just Jewish houses of worship, all over the country, about how they can be more inclusive and welcoming to people with mental illness and addictions and their families. In these brain health and faith talks, I raise in the communities what I think is a really fair question. After decades in American houses of worship of trying to include so many groups who are marginalized and discriminated against, how long before mental health gets included in inclusion? Think about it. There is, by the way, an entire other way of viewing the history of mental health and addiction, which is through the prism of the media that has covered it, and the handful of writers whose voices have loudest in doing that. I teach in that area at Columbia to journalists and physicians, and depend to undergrads, many of whom are trying to learn how to give voice to their own stories. It's interesting, challenging work, and I'll comment on just one aspect of it. I was part of a group in 2019 that put out a big white paper on mass violence in America. There was a lot of mental health professionals from all over the country, a handful of judges and law enforcement officers, and 2 lay people, Sue Klebold, the mother of one of the Columbine shooters, and me. I was in charge of helping the group understand the history of how mass shootings have been covered in America, starting with, and of course it's a Philadelphia area story because everything about mental health comes back to Philadelphia. The 1949 mass shooting spree in Camden, in which a veteran with mental illness, Howard Unruh, shot and killed 12 people. And we drafted media guidelines in this report, which were for mental health professionals, victims, and journalists. And then several months later at Columbia Journalism School, I oversaw a one-day symposium on these and other challenges of writing about mental illness with, among others, best-selling authors Andrew Solomon, Kay Jamison, Myra Hornbacher, New York Times health columnist Richard Friedman, and many other top reporters in mental health. Before I take questions, I want to make 2 points. One is that Patrick and I are working on a new book, which we think of as the Profiles in Mental Health and Addiction Courage. It will feature 20 profiles of people, some famous, some not, who have never before come out about their diagnosis, treatment, and challenges. We haven't filled all 20 slots yet, so if you have or know a resident mental health or addiction story to which we can give voice, you know where to find me. The other is that as I approach 40 years writing about American mental health and addiction care and doing work that reaches back more than 200 years before I started, I find in observing each generation, including ours today, very similar things to be outraged by, to be emboldened by, and to be comforted by. There are, in many ways, more things about the past, present, and future of mental health that are basically the same rather than radically different. Even as technology, medicine, government, and advocacy advance at their own rate, the reality remains that too few people who need mental health and addiction treatments we already have are getting them. There are too few people supporting those who need help. There are too few clinicians. There are too few evidence-based treatments. There's too much friction between the seriously and the less seriously ill. There is too much friction between psychiatrists and psychologists and other clinicians. Too much waiting around for future breakthroughs when we don't use or pay for what we already have and use anywhere near enough. There's too much friction and siloing between mental health care and addiction care, which are inextricably linked parts of the same thing. And I have a constant level of surprise about things that aren't, we have a constant level in our country of surprise of things that are not surprising. An endless need to sell to the public the idea that there's a new outbreak or epidemic of these mental illnesses when they in reality never get all that much worse or that much better. A constant well-funded pushback against all brain disease diagnoses from anti-psychiatry forces. And an endless need for someone in power to say that under my watch, I can focus on any scientific or medical situation, and I choose mental health and addiction. Every time I hear President Biden talk about his moonshot for cancer, I have to admit to feeling a little sad, even though both of my parents died of cancer. Because I remember seeing then Vice President Biden, before his son died tragically of cancer, giving those same exact speeches about a moonshot for brain disease, which in the aftermath of his own brain disease condition were then his priority. I still look forward to the day when the president and the leaders of the Senate and the House commit or recommit to making our next moonshot be fixing everything we can about mental health and addiction treatment. It is the single biggest way to make an impact on almost every medical and social ill in our great country. So please remember, there's no health without mental health. Thank you.
We have these things that Sophia is holding one in her hand right now. It's called a huddle pod. And if you have a question, we need you to just hang on until Sophia comes to you so that you can speak into the huddle pod. And that way the online audience will be able to hear you as well. And we're going to sort of alternate Q&A between folks here and folks online.
And the huddle pod will actually allow you to fly as well.
This is true.
Go ahead, you were first. Hold on, take the huddle pod. Oh, talk to the huddle pod.
My name is Michael. It's my honor to meet you, Mr. Fry. I read some of your stuff. It's really great. But I am UP trained professional, right? My time about 50 some years ago, when I asked my professor why the psychiatry since 1700 until 1900 didn't really do the darn thing, didn't move anything besides a few medication. And my professor answered it, There's not much money involved because it's not a money making, because American, we believe in money, right? And then another question, since 1965, psychiatric manual still not changing until today. We still follow the guiding to treat a patient, right? This is no lie, because who gave the idea, 1, 2, 3 put together. And another thing is about the term idiotic, actually it's a medical term back 1700, okay? Everybody is not considered normal for the idiot. Actually it's a medical term. So don't call your kid idiot, it's insulting, okay? So my question is, when we ever gonna realize how important part of life, that mental illness is a national disease, a serious matter, okay? And my second question is, Abe Lincoln is bipolar and neurosis, and this is true, right? But he treated himself. He would isolate himself, despair from 3 to 6 months. I don't know where he went, but he did a wonderful job, because that's what they say, the crazy Abbey, because he was so crazy, that's why he won the war. So
Well, let me address a couple of your points.
Okay.
First of all, I think we have to be careful cherry picking things from the past and assuming that they were done for negative reasons. Okay, I mean, you can't be mad at somebody in the 1700s during a time when there was almost no medical knowledge about mental illness and say, like, why didn't they know? Because what I would say is that I can show you the places where people were doing rudimentary care, and they were using medicine, they were using talk therapy, they were using occupational therapy here at Penn. I mean, we can always say that not enough people who had the illnesses got treatment. That's absolutely the case. But keep in mind, Pennsylvania Hospital was for the poor. No one made money there. Benjamin Rush didn't make money working there. He volunteered to work there. Pennsylvania Hospital was only for the indigent. Okay, so this is not, and I think that we have a knee-jerk reaction where people say, oh, it's just about money. I hate it when people say that, because they think they're being really smart, and what they're doing is undermining care. Okay, I interview mental health professionals my whole life. I interview patients my whole life. People have jobs, they have to earn a living. Okay, the idea that people create treatments to make money and create bad treatments to make more money, that's our fear, but that's not true. Okay, and that's sold to us by people who don't want us to get treatment. I'm not saying that drug companies don't make too much money. I'm not saying that I believe that all mental health professionals should have to take insurance and that the market should be set up that way. But the idea that you're getting bad care because somebody's trying to rip you off, that's our fear in America. And I wish people would disregard it, because when you've mental illness, you have many more things to worry about. And I know that you're afraid of this because, one, your treatments aren't covered the way they should be, and only the meds are covered, and that's not right. But you got to keep in mind that the people who are taking care of you didn't create this system, and they consider themselves as much a victim of it as you. And here's what I'll say about the DSM. Okay, the DSM has been villainized by people as if it makes the world a bad place. Okay, there are lists of illnesses for every kind of illness in the world. Okay, the DSM grew out of the effort to try to make a list originally of everything you could die from. Okay, so that this was needed by doctors so they could set up a cause of death, and the idea that they wanted to try to create a way of describing the illnesses so they could be differentiated. And again, I have interviewed many people who write DSM chapters. They don't think it's the Bible of anything. They think it's the best way possible to work in an area with an organ that we don't know enough about to be able to do any better. Every iteration of the DSM, and of course these guys and women, they fight over what's going to be in the next DSM. The idea that hasn't changed is completely not true. The DSM has been massively rewritten 3 times since the 1980s. And each time it's trying to respond to what we have learned since the last version was put into place, and trying to respond to the ridiculous idea, because keep in mind, all their diagnoses are put out for free by the government because the government pays for the research. Okay, no one cares enough about mental illness and addiction to pay for the research. So the American Psychiatric Association has to pay for it themselves. Do they make a lot of money on the book? Of course they do. Would they rather live in a world where psychiatry and psychology and addiction medicine were taken as seriously as all other medicines? The National Institutes of Health paid for that research? Of course they would. But we have to remember that the worlds of mental health and addiction are the worlds of, and I hate to say this, they're the damned. And they're the damned for the clinicians too. And what's really important is for people to realize, look, I'm not saying you shouldn't be mad at your doctor if you think he overcharged you or whatever. That's between you and your doctor. But the idea that this is a massive conspiracy is being sold to people, especially Americans, by people who do not believe in mental health care. They're not trying to make mental health care better. They're trying to tell you that mental health care is crap, that it's all crap and there's no such thing as real mental health care, because these are people who read The Myth of Mental Illness, which is a book that was a metaphorical book that was written in the 1960s, and they think it's a real, actual analysis of medical care today. So you and I could talk about this forever, but let's take some questions from other people. But all I want you to keep in mind is the possibility that the way this has been given to you, and sometimes doctors will say this really just in passing, and it makes a big impact on the people who need care. But I think that we always, as journalists, as clinicians, as fellow patients, we always have to ask ourselves about the things that we say to each other that are undermining of people remaining in treatment. Because the biggest thing that anybody will tell you, whether they're in treatment for addiction or treatment for mental illness, is that the biggest thing they wish they hadn't done was leave treatment. Okay, and no one talks about that. So all I would say is some of the things that you've been told, there's a little more to them than that. But let's take some other questions. Yes, sir. Give him the pod. Hold the pod with both hands.
Thank you so
Worship
much.
the pod.
And
Go ahead.
like it's a microphone.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I appreciate it. My name is David Rose. I am the principal for a biophilic design firm that's based in Philadelphia. We've been doing work over the past decade looking at some causality, like the pathology of mental health and wellness challenges in post-industrial, post-war American cities. And one of the things that we found is like looking at the source is really looking at Newton Baker and the first draft of World War I, and how the same gentleman was the same person that was involved in the first zoning laws that started to roll back the rights of municipalities to kind
You're talking
of
about redlining?
maintain some land. No. This
Okay.
is before that. What I'm talking about just is the environmental causes of mental health and wellness challenges for a majority of folks in urban areas like Philadelphia. And we see that biophilic design, or really, if you think the Mayans or some other societies that built their urban spaces inside of the forests, and really thinking about how that balance between nature and the built environment can really deal with some of the dissociative disorders that we're seeing rampant, especially post-COVID, and a lot of other issues that are happening that folks have fear, genuine fear and trauma from the days that you're talking about people locked in the basement.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm saying, is there, sorry about that. I'm saying, is there anything in your research that sees commentary on nature and that element as a potential solution or part of the
Well, let
toolkit?
me unpack a little bit about what you said. First of all, it's just your bad luck that I happen to be doing. My next book is about World War I. And the notion that Newton Baker is the one who changed the whole world is really not the answer. Trust me. Newton Baker was the Secretary of War. You know, he couldn't get elected president. The idea that he is the biggest reason why, especially people of color and people in the cities, have mental illnesses, that I'm sure that was a really good dissertation somebody wrote. No, but I understand. But what I'm saying is, here's the thing that's really important about this, and I would urge you, all the health equity writing that's being done right now. You know, I teach at Columbia, and I teach a lot of doctors who are very active in the health equity efforts right now. It's incredibly important to do the research that is correlative, okay, but to not try to pretend that we know what makes mental illness, because we don't. Okay, if you want to add nature, if you want to add redlining, if you want to add urban life to the list of things that might make some people ill and some people not, that's fine. But keep in mind that for every person who develops mental illness, there's someone who lives next door to them in the same exact situation who doesn't. Okay? So we have to be careful. It's important to do the work, and there's a ton of it being done right now. But we have to remember that it is sociological work. It is not work that would change if you had a bipolar break, how you would be treated, right? Because the only question that we want to know for you, since you are African American, is if there are any medications or any therapies that work better or worse for you than they would be for somebody who has been studied more, because what we know is that white men are studied more than women or people of color. So all I would say is keep in mind that the big theories are academic in nature. If you had the illness, they would not help you get better. They're interesting to know, they're interesting to read about, they are important to study. And we are studying more and more of them. And there's a whole list of things that just have to do with living in cities, and a higher proportion of people living in cities. You know, Thomas Jefferson wondered whether people should live in cities at all after looking at Philadelphia and hanging out there during the 10 years he was here. So I completely respect that work. My only concern about it is that it not get cross-referenced with what people who need mental health and addiction care, inpatient care, medication, therapy, insurance coverage, right? Knowing what you're describing doesn't help them get insurance coverage. It doesn't help them stay sober. It's an interesting thing to know about. It's important to study, and it's one of the, it gets into the thing. I have this debate with my students all the time. We always want to know why certain people get sick. We want to know why. But why isn't a question that we can really answer. We can speculate, and we can do studies, and we can make academic proposals, but somebody who has an illness wants to know how to get better. In a way, it doesn't matter why they got sick. One, we can't necessarily know it for sure. And two, the only thing that's important is whether what we know about their specific illness will help us treat them, right? So specific insult or trauma that was done to them personally is part of their care. Something that was done to everybody of color is important to study, important to know about, but the question you have to ask yourself is, again, if you were in a hospital, how would it help you get treated? I want all the work to be done. I just always want to make sure that people separate academic, important academic work that has been long overdue.
I want to go a quick point.
Go ahead.
I'm not African American.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think that's a part of the challenge, just that there is a level of understanding, as you mentioned earlier, that just requires, like you said, some more research.
No, I understand, but what I do think is important as we learn more about all these things is to keep in mind the parts of the conversations and the parts of the research that are big picture social descriptions, because they actually sometimes get in the way. For example, if you wanted to get a ton of funding for drug abuse, a ton of funding for opiate abuse, a ton of funding for alcoholism, you would have a certain number of people who would say, well, if we could just get rid of racism, there wouldn't be alcoholism. So why don't we spend the money fighting racism? Okay, because that's the nature of politics. That's the nature of America. So what's really important is for us to be able to support studying racism and stopping racism and taking care of people with opiate addictions and alcoholism and bipolar disorder. So that's all. So, and I don't think Newton Baker made that many people sick, but if you're interested in Newton Baker, there's a dual biography of Newton Baker and William Gibbs McAdoo, who's the subject of my next biography called Progressives at War, which you might want to.
Comment was just about him, they drafted, people didn't have a choice, black people didn't have a choice, they just drafted off of their family's farm and then ended up in public.
I understand. Thank you for your question.
I just want to say real quick that the audience online isn't able to hear comments without the huddle pod.
Oh, you didn't have the huddle pod.
Just at the end there with the comments. But so and I also will say that we have a couple of breaks built into our day tomorrow. So some of these conversations we can continue at that time. No, that's.
I'm not good at answers. I'm not good at short answers.
We do have an audience, an online audience question, and then we'll return to the room.
Do I have to talk in the pod to the audience member?
No, you're doing great.
Okay,
I got it. Wonderful. So first question from our online audience. Sorry, I'm hearing myself as well. were even the non-violent patients kept in the basement of Pennsylvania Hospital, or were people we would now consider as merely depressed, left untreated, and not thus imprisoned?
It's a good question. The truth is that we know way too little about what happened at Pennsylvania Hospital. There are snippets of what we know that were written down, and the life of the 9th Street building was not well documented. What I would say is keep one thing in mind. People didn't go to the hospital back then unless they really couldn't take care of themselves. You know, surgery was done in your house then. Okay, so the hospital was only for indigent people, and it was only for people who could not get care at home. So I think the answer to your question is that there was people who were violent in themselves had to be restrained, and they were restrained in different ways. From the design of the 9th Street building, I have to assume that there were some patients there who did not need to be restrained because it's the same as the 8th Street building, and it has floors that are floors with beds. But what I would say is that we have not looked hard enough at this. You know, we're so obsessed with the Institute and Kirkbride and everything starting in 1844 that we have overlooked. I mean, I have to say, honestly, when I was writing this book in a rush, I was stunned how much stuff had been done before 1844, because I grew up in Philadelphia and everybody told me that mental health started in 1844. So I would say that there has not been enough research on this. And but the records exist, and the records would even allow you could do a fascinating thing. You could go through the Pennsylvania Hospital records and not only write down the names and ages and diagnoses of every person who was a mental health case at Pennsylvania Hospital for decades, but also their race. I mean, they kept all that information. So it's actually, to me, an area that people could really do interesting research on, because again, my belief is that the time right after the revolution and when Pennsylvania, when Philadelphia was the capital, was a time when there was much better racial relations in Philadelphia than there was 10 or 20 years after. The assumption is because there was all this horrible anti-Black psychiatry that was done in the South in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, that this was just a linear thing. But in fact, you know, Benjamin Rush was very close with Absalom Jones, very close with Richard Allen, was involved in the foundation of the first Black churches in America. And so this was a time actually when not only for white people, but I think people of all races were probably getting different kinds of care at Pennsylvania Hospital than got it 20 years later when things got worse again. So all I would say is that we would love to know more about it. And my guess is that if we look harder, we will find it. It's part of medical history that Americans don't know that they could embrace, but I think it's actually pretty cool. Did you have another online question that you wanted to do? Oh,
This gentleman,
go ahead.
the gentleman in the front row.
Talk-based therapies such as CBT are evidence-based, but they're always going to be expensive. Another thing that we know helps, at least with depression and anxiety, is just human connection. I recently heard a program on NPR, Hidden Brain, basically an interview with Vivek Murthy, Surgeon General, where he just really talks about the pervasiveness of isolation on mental health. Is there anything being done to just foster connection?
To make people better people?
No, not better. Well,
but kind of
healthier, mentally healthier. Yeah.
I think that I mean, I heard that and I saw the Surgeon General's recommendations on that. You know, that to me is it falls in the area of, yes, it would be better if there was better connection, but if I had depression, I wouldn't be waiting for my community to be better connected to make me better. So like when I go give talks, these brain health and faith talks that I give in communities, you know, at houses of worship, I try to talk to them about creating an environment, because I do think that religious communities are one of the first places you could do this in. And I think whether people believe or not, and I think that houses of worship should be telling people, we don't care if you believe in what we're doing religiously, this should be a community. Because it's one of the only places where you can still have that kind of community. And those communities haven't been so great on mental illness and addiction. They've been better on accepting interfaith couples. They've been better on accepting all different races. They've been better on LGBT issues. They've been better on gerontology issues and on developmental disability issues for kids, and they have been on people who are teenagers, 20s, 30s, 40s, who have mental illness or addiction. They don't know how to deal with them. So I would say that one of the first places that could happen is in those kinds of communities. But yes, of course, being better connected would be better. And there are many books that are written about how the disconnectivity of America has made things worse. All I would say is that some of those books only look at today as if this was never true before. I could show you articles from the 1700s where people said the same thing. So what I'm saying is disconnection is part of living in a huge country. And anything we can do to connect people better is good. There's no question. But my only concern is in a zero-sum game of what's going to get paid for. I want the most money to go to the sickest people. Okay, so the people who can get better because of connectivity are less sick than the people who need to be hospitalized twice a year for depression. And all I want to make sure that if there's only a certain amount of money available, that money for the people who are chronically mentally ill, who are chronically substance use disordered and in and out of treatment, that those people get that funding. Because my view of the world is that you can't have both. And we live in a world, part of the reason psychiatrists and psychologists fight to some degree is because many of them treat different patients. Many psychologists, there are plenty of psychologists who treat very seriously mentally ill people. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but there are many psychologists who don't treat seriously mentally ill people. And there are some psychiatrists who treat really ill people. And the idea that they're kind of both in the same business, they are in theory, but not in practice. So all I want to make sure is that if there's enough for everything, if somebody wants to have a multi-billion-dollar bill that includes more money for mental illness and addiction and more ways of funding connectedness, I'm all for it. So I think it's important, but I think that it's a community-based thing. And if anything, it's for the community of people who are not ill to embrace the people who need the help. And I think that that's how you become connected, by not just the wellest people connecting, but the people who have different illnesses that they need that kind of community interaction. Go ahead, Nada. I'll get you after we get there.
So someone else is wondering, Stephen, did you uncover racial and gender disparities in mental health diagnosis and treatment? And they're asking particularly about the disease, in quotes, drapetomania, which was the supposed affliction of runaway slaves or self-emancipated enslaved persons. Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens from our program in African American history recently engaged with a historian writing about drapetomania at an event sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. So they're wondering.
Wow, that's a pretty in-depth question. We don't get that many questions with footnotes. So here's what you need to know about drapetomania. Drapetomania was a horrible idea that a handful of doctors at a Southern medical school, primarily the medical school at Transylvania. These were not like the people who could, these were not the people who could teach at Columbia. And in fact, one of them was somebody who couldn't get a job at Penn, who was one of Benjamin Rush's students who Benjamin Rush sort of forced out of town. These were people who, keep in mind that from the beginning of America, even before, there was a medical debate, a horrible medical debate, which was, are Black people the same as white people? Or are Black people suited for slavery because they are different? Now, Benjamin Rush and other doctors were very clear on this, that they thought that anybody who said that Black people were different were wrong. And Benjamin Rush knew. Benjamin Rush had a large African-American patient base. In the 1820s and 30s, especially in the 30s and the 40s, leading up to the Civil War, this became a bigger thing. But it's actually, while it's horrible, and these people did write things about it, it was not like a national phenomenon where every mental health professional in the country was trying to figure out if Black patients had drapetomania. It was literally a phenomenon of the South and of medical schools in the South who were supporting slavery at a time when slavery was just about to cause the Civil War. So all I would ask you to do, you should read about drapetomania. It's horrible. And the people who wrote about it, Samuel Cartwright, Charles Caldwell, these were the scum of medicine. The scum of medicine. The idea that they had ties to the Northern medical schools and that people in the Northern medical schools believed this, that's the part that isn't true. It has been associated by people. So I think it's really important to study the writing that was done on drapetomania and keep in mind that it's not like it was in the DSM, right? It was written by somebody who really was considered a crackpot in medicine. And as horrible as it is, we have to remember that it would have been more horrible if a lot of doctors all over the country thought this was right. And there is, in fact, no evidence for that. So it's important to read about. I mean, I'm friendly with people who've done wonderful papers on the drapetomania, but it's also important to keep in mind how isolated it was and where it was. It was really a phenomenon of the South, of the last gasp South before the Civil War. And the bigger question is, we don't have enough statistics on anybody with mental health care. The problem is that it has not been considered important to keep these statistics. It has been partly a fear of HIPAA and violations. Keep in mind that of all the illnesses that exist, none are treated off the books more than mental illnesses and addictions by people who are afraid to put it on their insurance, afraid that they will get fired if their bosses know they have it. So our statistics suck. And they would only be made better if there was a concerted effort to actually address these issues. But as long as people fear that if they say out loud they have bipolar disorder, say out loud they have depression, say out loud they have anxiety disorder, that they're struggling with alcoholism or with opiate addiction, that could end their lives or end their professional careers, you're going to have a tiny percentage of people who are even in a reportable world. But just add PTSD as well. So all I'm saying is that I wish we had better statistics. Most of what we have, and what you see in this exhibit here, it's the same kind of thing. There are testimonials that we get, pieces of writing, because they are all we have of certain times. But I would say that it would be useful. And one thing that's interesting, Pennsylvania Hospital claims that you shouldn't be able to look at the mental health records of the hospital going back to the 1700s because they think it's a HIPAA violation. I mean, I've had this fight with them a million times. It's crazy. HIPAA itself said it wasn't a violation. The Pennsylvania Hospital still keeps to the broadest look at this because there's actually a state law that's more stringent than HIPAA. So what I would say is people who are interested in the history of this, the first thing they should ask for is for the large institutions that exist for their records to be able to be seen. Because I guarantee you that if people are female, it's in those records. If people are of color, it's in those records. And so we should be able to look at what the diagnoses were. I mean, keep in mind that almost everybody in a mental institution was described as having schizophrenia for a long time, for decades and decades. But the research is there to be done, and I wish it was better done. And I hope that people hearing a talk like this, we're seeing the possibilities of these really old institutions, Friends Hospital, Pennsylvania Hospital, the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital. These are places that would have those kinds of records and allow you to ask those kinds of questions. This woman here has been waiting for a long time.
This has to be our last question. I'm sorry, we're super over.
Sorry.
I don't know if you just put a kibosh on my question, but I was going to ask you about Mary Gerard. If you came across any writings about her at Pennsylvania Hospital.
Sure. So, Mary Gerard was the wife of Stephen Gerard in the very small world of yellow fever and mental health care. While Stephen Gerard was criticizing Benjamin Rush for the way he was treating yellow fever, Stephen Gerard's wife, Mary Gerard, was a patient of Benjamin Rush's at Pennsylvania Hospital. So it's a pretty small world. I don't know that much about Mary Gerard's care. It's a whole other story right, but there's Mary Gerard's care. There's the issue that she had children in the hospital and who was the father, and because Stephen Gerard was one of the most powerful people in the city and funded a lot of things, you got to figure that Mary Gerard probably didn't get the benefit of the doubt in situations that had to do with her husband. But the Pennsylvania Hospital had really interesting people who were there, and it was not a secret that they were there. So several founding fathers had their kids there that Benjamin Rush was treating. Benjamin Rush's own son was there. Because it became the only place for people who were seriously mentally ill to at least get treatment. Not all of them got better. Not all of anybody got better. And what I would say to people when they say, like, well, people who take this drug, only 30% of them got better. You should look at what the percentages of every other drug and every other treatment does. If the only thing is what the percentage of people who get better on antidepressants, all I would say is like look at some other drugs and some other treatments so that you know what you're talking about. But Mary Gerard's a fascinating story. I think that there was a book written about her. I'm pretty sure that there's a book that's like an older book, but she's a great character. If somebody wanted to do just the thing about all the people who were in Pennsylvania Hospital during the 1790s and the early 1800s, it's a fascinating group. And then you can only imagine you're there and your doctor's taking care of you, trying to get you better. And then one day his son walks in. His son, the doctor. His son, the doctor who trained with some of those patients, right? In 1807 or 1804, John Rush is like a medical student at Penn. He's probably there treating those patients, right? 5 years later, he comes in looking like a biblical madman, his hair down to his shoulders, his fingernails grown out like Howard Hughes. And he's the son of the great Dr. Rush, who's supposed to be able to, save everybody from mental illness. It's fascinating and dramatic and very ironic. But Mary Gerard's a great story. And, look, one of the themes of this whole thing is making sure that we give voices to people with mental illness, people with family members with mental illness, and people who treat mental illness. It is amazing how few stories we have and how much we rely on them because there aren't enough stories. So I encourage you, all the stories that are being retold in this exhibit are really important. As many stories as we can give voice to, that's what's important. And now they're going to make me stop. No?
Actually, this has never happened in the history of anything before, but I just looked at our timeline again and we actually have another 10 minutes, right?
Oh my God.
So bring them on.
Wow.
This is great. I do want to take this moment to just say that what Mr. Fried was saying about the HIPAA records in Pennsylvania having more strict laws is absolutely true. We have a wonderful quilt in the exhibition. The only way the owners of the quilt were able to get the information they had was really because of the family members, the descendants, who were able to grant some permissions and give some other information. But these laws are incredibly strict in many states, and it really limits all kinds of medical history work. So.
But what I will say about that is that the families don't control that. It's the institutions not wanting you to see it. And I will tell you how we did the Rush book. Pennsylvania Hospital wouldn't let us look at any of those records, but it turns out someone had Xeroxed all of them and made PDFs of them and had put them in the collection of the American Philosophical Society. So we just looked at them there because, again, HIPAA only prevents your doctor or the descendants of your doctor from telling somebody about your case without their permission. It doesn't prevent you from seeing it if you see it. And if it's not against the law for a historian to see it some other way, it's a very specific thing. And it's made worse because of mental illness and addiction, which should be protected more because the people that have them are more at risk if people know about them. But there has to be a way for historians. We actually, until we found those, we were going to have a lawsuit. We went to the Scattergood Foundation. We talked about, would you help us pay for a lawyer? Think about all the research that could be done if we could free these documents. And they were ready to do it. And then we found out there was another copy of it. It's like, okay, never mind. Spend your legal money on something else this year. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the Scattergood Foundation is a wonderful foundation. The fact that it's based in Philadelphia, it's Quaker-based. It funds a lot of things that otherwise would not get funded, including academic things and work in the city that, if you wanted to get a program in place to look at the history of racial prejudice in mental patients or in substance use disorder patients, Scattergood Foundation is probably the first place you should be going to ask for funding or ask for encouragement. It's a wonderful place. It's in the Friends building down at 15th and Cherry. And it's named for, it's the money that when Friends Hospital was sold to a private company, that money was put into a trust to support mental health and addiction work. It's a wonderful organization, Scattergood.
Wonderful. So we have an international question. Hello from Australia. How do you feel about getting mental health education / awareness into our schools in a kid-friendly way to help remove the stigma of mental illness? Things are very similar over here, so obviously this is a global issue, but if we could start thinking about mental health as a society young enough, do you feel we could see significant change?
Well, it's interesting. Thank you for that question. There's two ways of approaching that. There is the aspect of school curricula having the ACEs issues, in terms of people looking at things that wellness issues for kids. So I think that some of the belief is that part of what you need to do with kids is focus on encouraging wellness. And And then the balance is how early you tell them about what bipolar disorder is and what, what depression is. So I think that there are double-edged swords that, the education of people generally is a huge issue. There's a thing called mental health first aid, which is a program that's available nationally. And its goal really is to take people who think they know about mental health but really don't, and give them like a across the board course so they can talk the talk, they understand what the different illnesses are, what the treatments are, and things like that. I think that the way that you would treat kids is a little different, but I think that it's important for people to do it. And I would say that honestly, given what's happening in our schools right now, people would fight it. Because one, the people from Scientology would fight us telling people that these are medical conditions because they don't think they are. And they would actually spend money trying to keep that from being in a school, which, I mean, can you believe it? But that probably would happen. And a lot of things that are tied to anything having to do with LGBT issues would have the same kind of controversies. But the simple answer to your question is the earlier that we explain to people, as early as you explain to somebody what cancer is and what a heart attack is, if you explain to them what mental illness and addiction are, because they're just part of the illnesses that somebody could have, and they're part of the illnesses that somebody needs to know about. And in some cases, there is first aid needed for them. Somebody should know what to do if somebody has a seizure. Somebody should know if somebody's having a manic reaction, who to help. If somebody is suicidal, who they should tell. So I think that we have to have age-appropriate answers for that. And my guess is we have them, and we just can't get them into the schools. I would tell you that a good rule of thumb is anything you think should be happening, there's actually a program for that nobody will pay for. Okay, it's not that nobody ever thought of how to fix it or anything like that. It's that not only is there a program for it, but it worked for 1 year. The 1 year it was paid for. And then it's been sitting on a shelf for somebody to pay for the second year or for all the years. So one of the great things about mental health and addiction, that one of the things that I feel really optimistic about is that, yes, we need better drugs, and yes, we need better therapies, and yes, we need lots of other things. But a lot of what we need is to spend money on the things that we already know work and make sure that people who need them get them easily. They don't have to fight with their insurance companies to get the time they need for detox and the time they need for inpatient care. And there should not be financial incentives to only take medication if medication and therapy are what the gold standard of treatment are. It's too easy to get medication and get it approved, and too hard to find a therapist and have that therapy be part of what you're doing. But we all know from an evidence-based perspective, nobody who ever does evidence-based work would ever say that therapy and medication aren't better than just medication. They unfortunately just look at the real world realities and go, well, if we can get you on medication, it's better than nothing. It's time for us to be doing better than nothing. Wait for the pod.
By the way, it was a great presentation. I learned a
Thank you.
good deal. And just very quickly, having done a lot of historical research on medicine in Philadelphia, many years ago, I was researching the life of a woman physician from the 1880s, a graduate of the Women's Medical College, and by chance, the first woman accepted into the Philadelphia County Medical Society. And later in her career, she worked at Norristown State Hospital.
Cool.
And I wanted to see if I could find something in her, what we would call a personnel file. And of course, it was a completely bricked up door. And I wasn't interested
Bricked
in—
up door, you're assuming it's there and they won't let you have it, or that they don't have it?
No, I don't know if they have it or not, because I couldn't get any access to look.
Right.
And I wasn't looking at patients, but at a physician staff member. But because of that, in Pennsylvania, at least, it's, as you know, because you tried to get around it, it's and you were able to by chance, but it's really a very difficult situation. And so much information is there, as you said. And so they hold these records, but don't let anybody see them.
Well,
but I have an entirely different sort of question. Say again, when was the National Institute of Mental Health created within NIH?
1949.
How
I
did
was
that,
surprised too.
how did that come about?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't researched it a lot. I mean, this is part of the post-war reality. World War II was really a time when people first started paying much broader attention to all psychiatric illnesses. had a lot to do with the fact that, World War I, we were only in it for like a year and a half. So while some of the things you learned during war, we weren't in the war long enough to learn. World War II, we were in it for a good long time. And so some of those things that you thought we would learn in World War I really came out of World War II. But that original National Institute of Mental Health is not necessarily the same as what ended up happening. The bigger political thing happened, National Institute of Mental Health existed, then it was folded into NIH, then it was taken back out in the early 1990s because NAMI fought to have it taken out, mostly to take care of psychotic illnesses. So the politics of where the Institute is interesting, but the bigger issue is what it does. And in reality, before the 1960s, the overall policy on mental health and addiction was pretty bad. I mean, people were all being warehoused in the same places. It was hard to diagnose and to know the difference between illnesses. There were very few effective treatments. And the asylums also had people with seizure disorder in them, that also had people with developmental disabilities in them, because people didn't know how to differentiate them either. So what happened, the bills that were passed, that Kennedy proposed and then got passed during his life and right after, they basically said this can't continue, okay? But they were being driven by people who were interested in developmental disability issues. They were interested in autism. They were interested in kids with birth defects. I know that's not the way to describe it, but they were more interested in that than in mental health. So that's how those kids came to be disabled and got all the medical benefits that they get for being developmentally disabled. And the people with mental illness and addiction didn't get that deal because that's not how it was being advocated for. It was really interesting to watch Patrick look at this because his aunts and uncles did this. I mean, this happened in part because of their unbelievable political power, and they had a developmentally disabled daughter who had lobotomy, and who they wanted to make sure that never happened again. But in fact, they did part of the job, and people with autism and all those different spectrum disorders have at least, I mean, it's not an easy life, but there's much more government support. And people with mental illness and addiction just kind of did not get that. The idea was they were going to build community mental health centers. They were going to spend a ton of money on that, and that's how it was going to work. And it just didn't happen, So look at what happened back there in somewhat historical fascination, but keep in mind that until there are actually medications, until the development of shorter term therapies, until the 60s, when you actually have more meds, you have the creation of cognitive behavioral therapy, you have different ideas about how to treat people if they're not warehoused, and different ideas about how you treat a 16-year-old who had a developmental disability as opposed to a 16-year-old who became suicidal at 15 and a half. It was pretty hard to know the difference between those for the government at that time. So I think that it's more interesting, even though there was an NIMH in 1949, to look at the phenomenon from the 60s on. It's about the 60s. It's about a lot of hope in the 70s, the Carter mental health bill that, then Reagan just threw out the window the minute he came into office and made things worse, things that were happening under the Clintons. It does, unfortunately, becomes a Democrat-Republican thing, except when there's a Republican who has power who has a mentally ill kid. So the most powerful person in mental health in our lifetime, Pete Domenici from New Mexico, powerful Republican, for which most urban Philadelphians would be against everything else he was in favor of. But he had a daughter with schizophrenia, and he made sure that people with serious mental illnesses got better coverage in the 1990s because of his own political power. So one of the things we have to look to in the government is not the agencies, because the agencies don't have enough power. They're all really trying. I mean, I know the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, Josh Gordon, he's a colleague of mine from Columbia, he's an amazing guy. They just need more power. They need more ability to influence the world. It comes down to presidents and senators and congressmen and congresswomen who have mental illness and addiction in their families, who want to step up and say that this is going to be part of our legislative priority. Because it only happens if it's them or there's actual doctors in Congress or in the Senate who want to step up and do it. And that's how you have to do it. It's hard.
Now
We're stopping. It's 7:30. Bong. I'm happy to stand around for a bit if you want to talk afterwards.
Yes, thank you so
but
much.
not to the people online. Well, we can pod with them.
Yeah, to those folks online, if you can come into town tomorrow, please do. We'll have yummy snacks, but otherwise, we're always happy to see you online. Can we please thank Stephen with our applause? That was remarkable.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.